Started. Good morning, everyone. Good morning to the second day, Tuesday morning. Is everyone awake? Looks like partially. All right, good, good. This is an exciting moment. I love the RIV competition here, and we get rolling here with some of our top plenaries here. A couple of reminders for this conference. Join us in the exhibit hall. Today at noon, there's a light lunch, and then there's a clinical vignettes poster competition. The research and innovations were last night, and now we have the clinical vignettes this noon here today. Top advances in research and innovations, 11 a.m. to 5:10 p.m. in Baltimore. And use your app and try to find those schedules and presentations and abstracts on there. And lastly, get on social media. If you haven't gone to all these sessions so far on Twitter, use your hashtag HospMed19 and tweet away. I want to thank the many volunteer reviewers. We had a ton of reviewers in the 30s, I think, for our reviewers, volunteer staff that came out to help, and hope it made for a wonderful, energetic competition. This year, we had over 1,000 people in our poster competition. First time we went over 1,000 in our history. RIV section chairs, I want to thank Stephanie Mueller, Christine Jones, Kelly Sponsler, and Eileen Barrett, and Poonam Sharma and Matthew Shanes. And we can do this without Jan Bowman as well. I'd like to announce the RIV winners, and hold your applause to the end of the screen here. For the best research poster overall, it was Ruth Bates with Overnight Cross Coverage on Hospital Medicine Services, Perceived Workload Based on Patient Census, Pager Volumes, and Patient Activity. And Monisha Bhatia for trainee using electronic health record phenotypic data to predict discharge destination. Give them a round of applause. And for our innovations, Jitinder Gujral demonstrating value for the telehospitalist program in a tertiary care center. And Cameron Locke presented by Molly Cantor, ending endoscopic delay, a multidisciplinary approach to reduce inpatient endoscopic delays. Join me in congratulating them. So today's session, we have 2 research studies and 1 innovation study. Our protocol is just about 10 minutes for talking, then followed by a couple minutes of Q&A. The session will end at 8:30 a.m. I'm going to welcome Dr. Catherine Lau here for our first presentation. It's on delirium reduction program leads to improved patient outcomes. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you to the SHM-RIV committee for inviting me today to present this work on behalf of the UCSF Delirium Reduction team. Delirium is common and serious. It affects over 7 million hospitalized adults every year annually in this country, with the number expected to go up with the aging population. Delirium is also associated with several negative consequences, including prolonged length of stay and increased ED visits and hospital readmissions. We know from prior research that as many as 1/3 of hospital-acquired delirium cases are preventable. However, programs designed to prevent or treat delirium have had variable success. We aim to study whether a multidisciplinary hospital-based delirium care pathway would be associated with reductions in length of stay on the inpatient medicine units. We conducted an observational pre-post interventional study at a single-center tertiary care university hospital over the course of 2 years, with 1 year being the pre-intervention period and 1 year being the post-intervention period. The delirium care pathway was rolled out on 3 medicine units, 2 of which were acute care and 1 was a step-down unit. The delirium care pathway did not include the intensive care unit. Our exclusion criteria in our study included age less than 50 years, length of stay less than 24 hours, any stay in the ICU during the hospitalization, and discharge from another unit besides the medicine units. We obtained our data from the Epic, Clarity, and Vizient electronic databases. Because delirium is often caused by multiple factors rather than one single factor in isolation, Our intervention was multifactorial and consisted of 3 main components. The first was screening. All patients arriving to the medicine units, both admissions and transfers, were screened using the AWOL tool to screen for delirium risk. The AWOL is a previously validated tool to screen patients for hospital-acquired delirium. Those who screened low on the AWOL score received standard care, whereas those who screened 2 or higher on AWOL were deemed to be at high risk for hospital-acquired delirium and were placed in the delirium care plan. This was the second component of our care pathway, which was prevention, and involved non-pharmacologic interventions aimed at maximizing mobility, improving sleep at night, improving wakefulness during the day, and improving access to visual and hearing aids. A pharmacist also reviewed the patient's medications to assess for the presence of deliriogenic medications. All patients on the unit were also screened every nursing shift for delirium using the Nursing Delirium Screening Scale, or NUDESC. If the NUDESC score was less than 2, delirium was not present and they received standard care, but if the NUDESC was 2 or greater, they did have delirium present, and again, they were placed in the delirium care pathway for treatment of delirium. It involved all the components of the preventative pathway and also involved notification of the primary team that their patient had screened positive for delirium and asking the team to evaluate and treat their patients for the underlying causes of the patient's delirium. This delirium care pathway was sequentially rolled out throughout our entire hospital over the course of 3 years. This particular study focused on the outcomes for the patients on the medicine units. Our primary outcome was hospital length of stay, and our secondary outcomes included hospitalization direct costs as measured by case mix index total costs, 30-day readmissions, restraint and safety attendant use, and delirium rates and severity. We could only study delirium rates in the post-intervention period because delirium screening and measurement itself was a part of the intervention. We had a 1-year baseline pre-intervention period. The post-intervention period consisted of 4 3-month epochs, with the first 3 months involving the rollout of the intervention itself. Our primary outcome, or length of stay, was measured in the baseline pre-intervention period and in each of the 4 3-month epochs. Similarly, some of our other secondary outcomes, including restraint and safety attendant days, 30-day readmissions, and total direct costs, were also measured in that manner. As mentioned previously, delirium rate and severity were only available in the post-intervention period, and the first 3-month epoch served as our baseline measurement. Outcomes were compared between time periods using a multivariate generalized linear, Poisson, and logistic model as appropriate, adjusting for clinical differences that were present. We also used a ramp-up variable to adjust for the time period it took for the intervention to ramp up in the medical center and the medicine units. We utilized an offset variable to incorporate length of stay into the calculation of delirium rates. This was not an interrupted time series study, as we did not have sufficient pre- and post-time periods to power the interrupted time series analysis. And now I will present our results. There were 11,600 medicine patients over the course of the 2-year study period. We excluded 4,928 patients as they were less than 50 years of age, stayed for less than a day, were discharged from a unit other than the medicine unit, or were in the ICU. This left 5,419 patients included in our study, 2,594 in the pre-intervention period, and 2,825 in the post-intervention period. Average age was 70 years, and other demographic variables, including severity of illness, did not change over time. Mean length of stay, or our primary outcome, decreased from 6.5 days in the pre-intervention period to 5.7 days at the end of the post-intervention period. This was a mean length of stay decrease of 0.8 days for all patients on the medicine units. This result was statistically significant. If we looked specifically at the subset of patients who screened positive for delirium in the post-intervention period, the mean length of stay decrease was even more significant at 1.9 days. The case mix index total direct cost, or one of our secondary outcomes, decreased by an average of $850 per patient over the course of the pre- and post-intervention periods. This result was also statistically significant. Actual direct cost savings to our hospital system over the course of the post-intervention period total nearly $1 million. The 30-day readmission rate also similarly decreased from nearly 19% in the pre-intervention period down to nearly 16% in the post-intervention period. Again, this result was statistically significant. Restraint and sitter use did decrease between the pre- and post-intervention periods with a trend towards improvement. However, this result was not statistically significant. Delirium days also similarly decreased in the post-intervention period from a peak of 178 delirium days per 1,000 patient days down to 129 delirium days per 1,000 patient days. Again, there was a trend towards improvement, but this was not statistically significant. Similarly, the delirium severity scores also had a trend towards improvement, but was not significant. There are several strengths to this study. The first of which is that this is one of the largest hospital-based delirium interventions studied, and is larger than the landmark Anyway paper published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 1999 that included 852 patients. Our patient populations were also similar over time in the pre- and post-intervention period, including severity of illness, therefore minimizing confounders. We were able to track adherence to our intervention, and this allowed us to determine when the intervention adequately took effect. This allowed us to avoid biasing towards the null hypothesis and highlighted the feasibility of our protocol. We also had extremely broad institutional support from our health system leaders, the medicine units, and the internal medicine residency program. There are a few limitations, the first of which is that delirium assessment itself was a part of the intervention, and as a result, we were unable to measure delirium rate changes from the pre- and post-intervention time periods. Secondly, this was a large, pragmatic quality improvement initiative, and patients were not randomized to the intervention itself. Because we lacked a control group, we cannot definitively exclude other factors contributing to our improved outcomes. In conclusion, the implementation of a comprehensive, multidisciplinary delirium care pathway was associated with significant reductions in length of stay, hospitalization direct costs, and 30-day readmissions. There were also improvements in restraint and sitter use, as well as delirium rate and severity. The implementation of this multidisciplinary delirium care pathway resulted in big benefits for both our hospitalized patients and the hospital system itself. I'd like to acknowledge my wonderful co-authors, as well as all of the faculty and staff in the UCSF Division of Hospital Medicine. I'd also like to acknowledge my fabulous colleagues in our medicine unit-based leadership team, for whom this work would not be possible, as well as the UCSF internal medicine program leaders who supported this work and made delirium reduction their QI goal for the year. Lastly, I'd like to thank the UCSF health leaders who provided extremely strong executive leadership and support. I now invite your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Lau. That was impressive. Love it. This is the top, again, plenaries are the top 3 of 1,000 abstracts that are out there, so impressive work here. I'll tee off the questions if others want to come up to the mics that are sitting nearby there. So you provided the delirium care pathway at some level. I'm curious, what does the pathway entail? Are there pharmacologic bundles? Are there non-pharmacologic pieces that are there? And secondly, how in the world did you get buy-in? How do you actually operationalize this?
Yeah. So for the first part of your question, this was very much a heavy non-pharmacologic care pathway because we know for delirium prevention and particularly treatment, most of the evidence out there shows that it's actually the non-pharmacologic modalities that have the biggest impact. And again, it was first highlighted in that landmark New England Journal article in 1999. There were some there was definite pharmacy involvement, but less pharmacologic involvement. Really, the pharmacologic involvement was with the pharmacist reviewing the medication list and making recommendations saying, this medication would put the patient at higher risk for delirium. Would you consider switching it, changing it, or retiming the administration of the medication itself? In terms of buy-in in the hospital system, this was really a great example of the top-down and also the bottom-up approach. So this was a nice serendipitous time where the health system leaders were looking for value improvement initiatives that could significantly improve both the quality of care in the hospital and decrease costs, while there were big moment, there was a lot of momentum on the behalf of a lot of the frontline leaders to actually change our health system to make it more what we call inpatient age-friendly. And so this delirium reduction pathway was part of that age-friendly inpatient program. And the health system leaders, when they heard about it, said, this is what we need to do. And our chief nursing officer, our chief medical officer, chief quality officer got really behind it. And their support was key to really get all the interdisciplinary players involved and push forward the work.
Fantastic. We'll take one or two more questions if people want to use the mic in front here.
I have a question over here.
Go ahead.
Hi. Thank you very much. That was very interesting, Vinnie Aurora, University of Chicago. I was really interested in the multi-component protocol adherence because you mentioned adherence rates did vary, and I know in the INUA studies they varied widely, and actually adherence to the sleep part was only 10%, which is always, I found interesting that they got their effect. And so I was curious, are you able to parse out what exactly of the package was most significant,
Right.
or do you plan to?
In this particular study period itself, I honestly feel the part that was the most significant and the most highly reliable in terms of it being accomplished and carried out was the screening for delirium itself. And just that recognition that either your patient was at risk for delirium or actually had delirium really raised awareness of delirium across the hospital, from the nurses, the patient care assistants, to the residents and the attending physicians. So that was really key. We're still definitely working, and we have other initiatives to improve mobility in our hospitalized patients. Some of my colleagues who lead that are sitting in the audience right now. We still have initiatives going on to improve sleep, and our sleep compliance right now, it ranges. So, right now for patients who are on our acute care floor, sleep promotion vitals is about at 50 to 60%. And then in terms of whether or not they're actually sleeping during that entire time, we're studying right now through wrist actigraphy monitors. So there's still work to be done on that, but definitely during the period of the study itself, I personally feel that the part that really contributed to a lot of these findings was the fact that we were doing the screening and really getting the word out.
Thank you. Any more questions? All right, just join me in giving a round of applause for Dr. Lau. Our second presenter is Dr. Patrick from Cleveland, Ohio, VA Medical Center there, improving hospital outcomes for alcohol detox. Join me in welcoming him.
Morning, I'm Rob Patrick from the Cleveland VA. It's always tough going after an actual smart person, but you guys can see they sandwiched me between two smart people to soften the blow a little bit. All right, so I'm Rob Patrick. I'm from the Cleveland VA. Here's my partners in this project, Dr. Laura Brown, who's out here, our pharmacist, Allison Daly, and our two programmers, Randy Stallnecker and Shawana Vance. I'm going to talk to you today about improving alcohol detox outcomes in your hospital. We're going to talk about the outcomes first in my shameless plugging effort to get you to try this at your hospital. So I'm going to prove to you that it works first. Then I'm going to tell you how we did it, and most importantly, how you can take it home and do it at your hospital. So this is a control chart. For anybody who's not familiar with these, it's a statistical method that was developed in industry. All you have to know is the white boxes and the red boxes are what's called special cause, which you can think of as statistical significance. So we had a baseline, a steady baseline. We implemented in February of 2018, and you see an immediate drop in number of admissions. It took about 6 months to get to another steady baseline, and for the last 6 months, we've been at a new steady baseline that's statistically different from what we were doing before. Same thing happened with readmissions, because the best way not to readmit a patient is not to admit him in the first place. And the same thing happened with length of stay. So if you look at all of our hospital outcomes, here they are. Before we started this project, we didn't do any outpatient detox at all. We're doing about 7 a month now. Hospital admissions were at 24, down to 11. 30-day readmissions are down below 1. Mean length of stay is down by half a day. Hospital days are down by almost 60%. And this was one of our biggest admitting diagnoses. So this represents a lot of patients and a lot of hospital days. In terms of process outcomes, one of the things we wanted to do was to try to admit more patients to OB status and get them out of the hospital soon, within 48 hours, so they don't count as a full admission, because that keeps the administration happy because then they can't be readmitted to the hospital. We also tried to decrease the amount of time patients spent on our CEWA protocol because we felt like a lot of it was wasted. We wanted to decrease the workload for our nurses too, which was a big selling point with them. And we did that successfully. We also, as you'll see in a minute, felt it was really important to decrease the number of benzo doses. So we did all this stuff, but we needed a balancing measure. There was a lot of skepticism about reduction of benzo doses and getting patients out of the hospital early. And people said, well, if you do that, they're going to decompensate on the floor, and then they're going to have to go to the ICU. So we actually measured that. And the best way to look at that statistically is to look at days between events. So days between ICU transfers. And you can see here that we went up to 160 days with no ICU transfer from the floor, which was a record for us. It's not special cause yet, but if you look at ED transfers to the ICU, it is special cause. And the argument there was, if we're doing something wrong, patients are going to show up to the ED sicker and need transfer from the ED straight to the ICU. And in fact, that didn't happen, and it happened less. Lastly, you'll see one of our process interventions was to call patients who we discharged home on gabapentin to make sure they were doing okay. And everybody told us, oh, you're never going to get a hold of them, they don't have phones, they're homeless, yada, yada, yada. And you can see what our contact rate was. It was almost 90%, which for any of you that work at a VA, is pretty extraordinary. All right, so the three core principles that I'm going to tell you about that sort of drove this intervention were you got to discharge from the ED, you got to use a benzodiazepine sparing inpatient CEWA protocol. And you also have to do structured telephone follow-up. You really need to make sure these guys are doing okay at home when you discharge them. So how did we do this? We stole shamelessly from other hospitalists, basically. This algorithm came from the UNC hospitalist group. It was published in JGEM, I think in 2014. Thank you so much for doing this, if you're out there. This was hugely helpful to us because these guys had already established that this was safe and it would work. Basically, they come in, if they're suicidal, they go to our psych-ED. If not, they get a breathalyzer or an alcohol level. The two critical factors in screening patients in the ED for us are a sober CEWA score and a documented history of complicated withdrawal, all right? So if they're not sober, we try to get the ED to observe them. Doesn't always work. We sometimes have to admit them. But once they're sober, we do a CEWA, and we really dig through the chart to try to get documentation, not just, oh, I passed out. I don't remember what happened for a day. And here's the screen that we do, high risk, low risk. If you're above 15, you automatically get admitted. If you're below 8, you automatically go home. And it's in that middle section, the 8 to 15, where the real decision-making comes in and where people might get a little bit uncomfortable with this. If you don't have a documented history of complicated withdrawal, you can go home on gabapentin with a CEWA of 15. So, and I showed you that actually works. Patients don't bounce back. So we screen them, we admit people that need to be admitted, we send a lot of folks home from the ED, and we send them home on gabapentin and Ativan. This is just what we chose. This is what our psych pharmacist and our psychiatrists like. We really like the gabapentin. There's a lot of good data for that. They wanted a benzo. We weren't too thrilled about that, but we wanted to make sure they were on board, so we picked it. 5 days of gabapentin or 3 days of Ativan. So the VA has something called an e-consult, which is basically where a consultant can answer a consult without actually ever physically seeing the patient. And so it goes to the consultant, they review the chart, and they render an opinion without actually seeing the patient. So we use the same process. This is something that ubiquitous across the VA. We use it as a notification system. So the ED doc sees the patient, says, I think this guy can go home. I'm going to put in an e-consult. That e-consult comes to Laura or myself the next day. That's our trigger for starting to call the patient at home. That e-consult also leads to an order set that's very simple, very easy to use, and all the directions on the risk stratification are right there in it. There's no papers on the wall, there's no PDFs, you don't have to go anywhere else to know how to use this. Okay, benzo-sparing protocols. This turned out to be one of the most important things that we did. We didn't realize it at the time. Any of you, who treats alcoholics out there? Who detox? Or almost everybody. Okay. Who thinks that the CEWA score is a great objective measure of your detox status? not a single person. All right, we don't either. So it's easy, it's very subjective, it's easy for patients to game it or nurses to game it, so we wanted to add some objective criteria, and what we chose is both systolic blood pressure and heart rate. And again, that was just an institutional thing. There's other benzo-sparing protocols out there in the literature. We'll send you the references if you want. So if you're less than 8, you don't get any meds. If you're more than 20, you go to the ICU. And if you're in the middle there, it really depends on whether your heart rate and your blood pressure are elevated. If you've got a high-ish CWA, we ask the nurses to tell the doctor to come see the patient and evaluate them personally if they're going to give them medications. The idea is we want to raise the bar a little bit, the threshold a little bit to giving benzos. Again, this note, it sounds complicated. It's very intuitive and easy for the nurses to use. It was existing VA technology that we just pulled into the note, and we did a ton of training with the nurses on this. This is our dashboard that Laura and I use for patients that are admitted to the hospital. So every morning we run this. We know everybody who's in the hospital right now and ever got even one CWA score. So we look at it, we look at the EMR, we see what the CWA scores were overnight, whether the patient got medicated or not, and we call our partners on the floor and go through that algorithm with them that I just showed you and say, hey, does this guy really need to still be in the hospital, or could he go home on gabapentin? Or if he does need to be here because you're working him up for other things, could you shut off the CWA so you're not wasting the nurse's time? The last thing is structured telephone follow-up. We call these guys every day for 3 days. We document it in a note. We ask them about maintenance of sobriety. So it's not enough to just get them through their detox. You really want to get them on the path to sobriety and staying out of the hospital so you're not seeing them in another month in your ER. And then we email the provider who sent us the patient and go, hey, Mr. Jones did great on gabapentin at home. You know, congratulations, send us more business. All right. So, most important thing is, how can you do this at home? So if you're at a VA, all the technology that I just showed you is already built for you. The dashboards are built, the databases are built, the notes are built. We'll send it all to you. But you don't have to be at a VA to do this. And most importantly, you don't have to have a cooperative ED to do this. You can do it just within your hospitalist group. So first thing you have to do is fix your symptom-triggered therapy. You got to get off standard tapers if you're using them, and you got to move to symptom-guided therapy, and you really have to use a benzodiazepine-sparing protocol. If you don't shut down the candy store, these guys are going to keep coming back. So use a regimen and really, really train your nurses. Spend time there. It'll pay off later. Get consensus in your group on the algorithm. Everybody has to be speaking from the same sheet of music. Build a dashboard, install it. Set up your infrastructure to make your phone calls to patients. And call your colleagues. Don't be afraid to have those conversations. It's tough at first because not everybody's on board. But once my partners saw how this worked, I don't have to call them anymore. It's already done by the time I call them. And again, you do not need the ED to cooperate to do this. You can make a lot of improvement without them. Here's our references and Go VA. There's my email. Please email me. Be happy to run through this with you in detail and help you.
Again, we'll take a couple questions here. Maybe I'll tee it off again to start. Such a rare topic, right? Who does alcohol withdrawals, right? But I think when we look at this topic, you did it at the great VA. I know I see several VA people out in the audience here. For those of us who work at community hospitals or academic centers, or even just the smaller community hospitals and critical care access hospitals, how does this translate? You covered that, it does translate. What are some tips on how would that actually play out?
So we're already working with at least one community hospital. They haven't implemented yet, but we're hoping to get them there. Any hospital with a EMR, which almost everyone has, and almost all of those EMRs download into a corporate data warehouse. So this is not rocket science programming, and that dashboard was built with off-the-shelf software. So almost any decent programmer at any institution can build all this tech for you, and then really, it's just getting your group organized and on the same page. Like I said, you don't need the ED to come along with you. It's nice if they do. But you don't absolutely have to have that. And please don't be intimidated by the technology. It's not that tough. Again, if you're at a VA, we've got everything for you. We'll send it to you. It can all be sent over Reminder Exchange. Please don't reinvent the wheel, all right? Use what we have.
Thank you. We have a question over here.
Yeah, great study, by the way. I really love the benzodiazepine sparing aspect of your study. That being said, did you consider phenobarbital, perhaps, as a phenobarbital as a treatment for alcohol detox over benzodiazepines?
Did I consider what over benzodiazepines?
Phenobarbital?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So we did, and we actually that's on our inpatient regimen, but our psychiatrists preferred the gabapentin and the Ativan for outpatient treatment.
Right, yeah.
We still do use phenobarb sometimes on inpatients if they're really bad.
Yeah, at my institution, we pretty much have veered away from benzodiazepine now as part of the alcohol. Actually, in the ICU, in my facility, they don't even use CWA anymore. They use phenobarbital and RAS.
And what's the second thing they use?
Phenobarbital and RAS.
Oh, yeah.
So that's it. I mean,
yes.
a lot less
Are you
labor
from Minnesota?
intensive. Oh, no, we're at Fort Bragg, North Carolina.
Okay.
But it's a lot less labor intensive and much easier
Yeah.
to use for nursing, for doctors.
Yeah.
Cool.
There's a lot of ways to skin a cat. The important thing is, again, this is not surprising. You have a bunch of addicts, and you bring them into the hospital for, 3 hots and a cot and an Ativan party, and then they keep showing up. Surprise, who's the idiot here?
Thank you.
On that note, any other talk? Any other folks have one more question? All right, just give another round of applause.
I'm going to put in a shameless plug for the VA. Come work for us. It's great. No funding. This was all just begging time from people.
Well done. Who said there's no comedy up here as well, right? All right. Last but not least, we have our third presentation is Dr. Schnipner, and from Boston, Harvard Medical School, Brigham and Women's. And this is on Med Rec Scaled Up. This is actually Marquee 2, not Marquee 1, so results from that. Please join me in welcoming him.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for being here, and I want to thank the RIV committee as well. I would like to also thank all of my co-authors on this work. It's my pleasure to talk with you today about Marquee 2, yes, the adventure continues, and some of our final results. Here are my conflicts of interest. Okay, so transitions of care into and out of the hospital are vulnerable times for patients, especially when it comes to medication safety. And this is for a variety of reasons, including discontinuity of care, multiple medication changes that we make to the regimens. Discharge itself is a very rushed event. There's often inadequate patient education and a lack of follow-up after discharge. And so the result are medication discrepancies, so unintentional differences in medication regimens across different sites of care. So patients are on one regimen before they come into the hospital, another regimen in the hospital, and another regimen after they leave, not for medical reasons, but because we mess up this process. And so the purported solution to this is medication reconciliation, or MedRec, which is a process of identifying the most accurate list of all medications a patient is taking and using this list to provide correct medications for patients anywhere within the health system. And I like this particular definition, which is from the IHI, because the focus is not on the regulatory requirement or checking a box or making a list. It's making sure the patient is on the right medications throughout the continuum of care. So this process involves several parts, and this is from work done by Jeff Greenwald and his colleagues as part of an SHM-led multi-stakeholder conference. So the first step is verification, right? So this is developing an accurate list of each patient's medications. Then there's clarification. So it's validating the medication, the dose, and the frequency at the time of writing orders. And then finally, there's reconciliation. So it's identifying and correcting those unintentional discrepancies. There's documenting the changes when you did do it on purpose, and then communicating the list to the next providers of care after discharge. So this is really hard to do, and the results for patient safety have been spotty at best. And so in response, we did the first multi-center medication reconciliation quality improvement study, or Marquee 1. This was done with 5 sites around the country. One of those sites did not implement any interventions. Of the other 4, 3 of them did have improvements in their total discrepancy rates. And overall, there was an 8% reduction in discrepancies per month over baseline trends compared with control units. What happened to that 4th hospital? Well, they implemented a new electronic health record, and surprise, they saw the rate of their discrepancies markedly go up. And the same is true for that 5th site that didn't implement any interventions. They also adopted a new EHR and saw their rate of discrepancies go up. So in general, Marquee 1 worked to a degree. I would say the results were good but inconsistent. In the process of doing this study, we made the intervention better. We refined the toolkit, and we learned a lot of lessons about implementation. So then we were ready, and we received funding from AHRQ for a second round of mentored implementation at 18 sites. So the specific aims of Marquee 2 were first, to implement the refined Marquee evidence-based MedRec toolkit at 18 diverse hospitals using a mentored quality improvement implementation model. Second, to rigorously evaluate the effects of the Marquee program on unintentional medication discrepancies. And third, to inform future spread of MedRec interventions by performing an evaluation of program evaluation using the RE-AIM framework. So this is the implementation science piece or the study of the study. Today, we're going to talk about AIM-2, the main quantitative results of the study. So here's the front page if you go to the SHM website and look up MedRec or Marquee, and this takes you to all of the components of the toolkit. They are all free and available to use. So what's in the toolkit? So it's a compilation of best practices around MedRec with resources to support deployment of intervention components. So it's got an updated Marquee implementation manual. It's got pocket cards on how to do a best possible medication history or BPMH. It has a video on how to do a BPMH. It's got simulated cases to certify competency of your staff in taking a BPMH. It has a discharge counseling video, and it has a return on investment calculator, so you can convince your C-suite to invest resources in this work because it will definitely pay back 4 or 5-fold. So here's where our 18 sites were. As you can see, there's 3 different colors because we had 3 different waves of 6 hospitals each. They were offset by 6 months, and this gave our mentors time to work with 1 or 2 sites at a time and really get them up and running before moving on to the next sites. It also gave some flexibility to the hospitals when they wanted to get started in this work. So these 18 sites were selected by way of a formal application and review process from 72 sites that applied. The revised toolkit offered 17 intervention components, which I'll go through in a few minutes. 1 out of 8 hospitalists trained in QI methodology coached each of the sites by way of the mentored implementation model, which has now been very well established by SHM. This included monthly phone calls with each site's MedRec QI team leaders, 1 to 2 site visits over the 18-month implementation period. And then each site's QI team locally assessed their practices, identified improvement opportunities, and implemented 1 or more of the toolkit components on medical surgical units. The primary outcome were unintentional medication discrepancies in admission and discharge orders. And this is what we've been doing for a number of studies over the years. And it starts with the gold standard medication history, and that's compared to the orders. In order to determine the shape of the curve of medication discrepancies over time, we did 2 things. So first, we looked at statistical process control charts, which you just heard about in the last presentation, as well as restricted cubic splines to get a really good shape of the sense of the curve. And then our formal analysis was an interrupted time series. So we looked at the effects of the intervention over time, adjusted for pre-implementation temporal trends. And we looked at the number of discrepancies per patient as our primary outcome using multivariable Poisson regression adjusted for patient covariates. The total number of gold standard meds was a model offset, so sort of obligatory covariate, and we clustered by site. To understand the mechanisms by which our intervention improved discrepancy rates over time, we wanted to separate out the effects of system-wide interventions, so things like getting better access to pre-admission medication sources or clearly delineating roles and responsibilities, from the patient-level intervention. So did this particular patient get a BPMH in the emergency department before they were admitted, for example? And so we did a number of analyses, which I'll get to when we go through the results. So here's the patient cohort. We had about 5,000 patients across our 18 sites. You can see the post-intervention period was a little longer than the pre-intervention period. Anytime you have 5,000 patients, you're going to be probably overpowered to show differences in patient characteristics, but I would just point out a couple of things. In the post-intervention period, there were a few more patients on medicine services, and also there were fewer patients who had a high baseline understanding of their medications. So here's the statistical process control chart. As you can see, over the 18 months of the implementation period, the total number of medication discrepancies per patient dropped from about 3 per patient to about 1 per patient. And you can see that starting by about month 10, we're outside the SPC limits, right? So we're talking about special cause variation here. So definitely we're at a new standard of care by the end of the study. Here's the restricted cubic spline analysis with 4 knots, and you can see that basically it's a downward linear curve throughout, and you can see that there's a little bit more of a steepness to that curve after the first 6 months. And here's the formal interrupted time series analysis. So there's no sudden improvement in discrepancy rates the day that you implement the intervention, so there's no change in the y-intercept, but there is a change in the slope. So once they started doing the intervention, there's a 5% relative reduction in total medication discrepancies per month, every month, over the course of the study. And if you do that for about 14, 15 months, you will get to about a 2/3 reduction in your discrepancy rates, which is what we finally found by the end of the study. So let's look at those system-level interventions. All of them are listed below, as well as how many of the sites implemented each of those intervention components. You can see that at the beginning of the study, the average site implemented about 2 system-level interventions, and by the end, they had plateaued out on an average of about 8 out of the 17 toolkit components. So did this actually impact care? Does this explain our improvements over time? Well, not by itself. You can see that if you look at the patients who got no patient-level interventions, and you compare the first 6 months of the study to the last 6 months of the study, the change in total discrepancy rates is not that big and not statistically significant. So these system-level interventions don't work by themselves. What about the patient-level interventions? What about intervention fidelity? So you can see at the beginning of the study, about 20% of eligible patients were getting these patient-level interventions, so a BPMH in the ED, or MedRec at discharge, or patient counseling. And by the end, about 60% of the patients who were eligible were getting these kinds of interventions. This is thousands of patients. We only sampled, a limited number per site. So did this make a difference? Absolutely. So when you look at patients who got at least one patient-level intervention compared to those who didn't, their discrepancy rates are much lower. And moreover, what you can see is that by the end of the study, the impact was even greater. So by the last 6 months of the study, those patients who got patient-level interventions had 1/3 of the rate of discrepancies as those who did not. So this suggests that maybe there's some synergistic interactions here between the system level and the patient level interventions, right? So if you improve the training of your history takers and you give them better access to medication sources and you improve your HIT and you make roles and responsibilities clear, now when you have a BPMH taken by one of those trained individuals, the impact is very large by the end of the study. So in conclusion, the marquee interventions, including the toolkit and mentored implementation, are associated with a marked reduction in medication discrepancies. And implementation of both system and patient-level interventions improved over time, so both dose and fidelity increased. The patient-level interventions had more of an impact on results than the system-level interventions by themselves, but there may have been a synergistic effect. The study has a few limitations. Not every site contributed equal amounts of data. We have not yet analyzed the data to explain the site-level differences or which intervention components were associated with the biggest improvements. We're doing that work now. And the sites were hand-picked, so you could say there's some issues with generalizability. But why would you spend all this time, money, and effort and resources if the sites are not ready to change? So what are our next steps? Our strategies for sustainability and spread. We're working with our Marquee 2 sites to sustain their gains. And another shameless plug, we now have a Marquee collaborative. Open enrollment is happening now. We would love hundreds of sites to sort of take on this work and adopt the toolkit. We give you the toolkit plus a timeline, quarterly webinars, monthly office hours, data collection tools, training materials, and peer support. We're going around the country doing Train the Trainer BPMH workshops. We're certifying pharmacy techs as history takers and pharmacists as MedRec leaders. We're working with Leapfrog, which is now measuring medication discrepancies the same way that we are. So hundreds of hospitals are measuring this, realizing how bad their baseline practices are, and hopefully inspiring them to improve. And we're working with the EHR vendors to improve their products. So I'd like to acknowledge all the members of the Marquee core team. This takes a lot of work by a lot of people to do this. Our Patient Family Advisory Council and our steering committee, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you for that excellent talk. Fantastic. I have just, again, questions can come up to the mic here. Taking this off, I wanted to just think of this. You did a lot of work on discrepancies, right? And so just trying to think through, I'm a diagnostic error kind of a novice here, trying to learn into that space. And so as I think about that, does that actually affect the patient's level outcome, patient's level understanding of the diagnostic process? Does it help their adherence? Have you looked at any of that realm? We looked at discrepancies, but are we getting at outcomes that get at the patient level?
Absolutely, it's a great question, and it's one that I often get. It's like, oh, great, so the pharmacist fixed the multivitamin, who cares, right? So the first thing that I would say is that there's not a single multivitamin in this study. We only looked at prescribed medications. There's no nutraceuticals, no vitamins, no Sarna, no saline eye drops, no ocean spray. So these are real meds. We also know from our prior work that the number of discrepancies is closely correlated with the number of discrepancies with potential for patient harm. What we're hoping to pull out of this data, which we have not been able to pull out of the only 5-site data, is that the patients who got interventions actually have lower lengths of stay and readmission rates than those who don't. So that data's coming. Hopefully it'll be positive, and then maybe that'll be the thing that explains, that motivates the C-suite to make the change. But, these 5,000 patients were on, 30,000 prescription medications, and you're going down from 3 errors per 1 error per patient, a 300 error rate to a 100% error rate. Like, you gotta wonder, there's probably some clinical impact there. But yeah, we need to do a better job, I think, of proving it, and I think we will this time around.
Fantastic, yeah. Others with any questions? If you want to come up to the mic here, there's a question in the back there. If you want to come up to the front mic.
Have you looked at the OBS phenomenon and given the transition risk coming in and then being discharged in such a short period of time? Have you looked at that issue with respect to discrepancies?
That's a great question. So have we looked at the OBS unit, so these patients who are coming in for a very short period of time and leaving? No, we haven't. These are all admitted patients. Most of our hospitals, what they're doing is they're prioritizing the patients being admitted and doing a BPMH on them, but then if they get to all of them, then they will usually go down to the patients who are still in the ED and maybe admitted to OBS or maybe discharged from the ED, because there's no question that we can certainly mess up their meds plenty from even a short stay. And you're right, we do need to focus on those patients as well. I give them second priority, but it is a big issue, so thank you for bringing it up.
Terrific work, Jeff. Congratulations. Couple of questions. The first is, this gets back to the recruitment of hospitals. Can you sort of share with us a little bit about the process for assessing readiness to implement and what you've learned about both, how to know when a hospital is really ready to implement and what we can do at our own hospitals to perhaps move that needle, move that process along. And then secondly, I think there was a time when we all thought the EMR vendors were going to solve mid-rec for us. Yeah. So can you also reflect, you've been doing this for so long, about the degree to which this is an IT problem or a larger problem, and how those two kind of relate to one another?
I'm glad you gave you such easy questions. So getting to the first question, here are the criteria from the applications that you can see, and this could all be boiled down to, sites are ready, willing, and able to do this work, put resources behind it, and measure outcomes. And what we found from Marquee 1 especially is that it really was high-level buy-in from hospital leadership that made this work possible. When they were behind the effort, everything worked, or most things worked. And when they weren't, nothing worked. And so I would say it's really got to be hospital leadership, and they have to believe that this stuff actually improves care and reduces costs, which is why we spent so much time on these return on investment calculations, showing how it reduces inpatient adverse drug events, eventually reduces readmissions to the hospital. Once they believe that stuff and they put their money behind it, it definitely helps. Using pharmacy techs instead of pharmacists in the ED really helps a lot. They're a lot cheaper. And they're very good at doing this work, and we've got evidence for that. So I think those were sort of some of the keys to that piece. As for the EHRs, so most vendor EHRs, their MedRec modules are terrible. and I could talk in depth about why that is. I think they're improving. I think we need to publicly shame them into improving their products. And there's never going to be an IT fix entirely. I think you're always going to need a trained person to make sense of the chaos. Until one day maybe we have a universal medical record in the cloud, purely secure, that's the single source of truth. I've been arguing that for years, and people usually laugh at me, and maybe that'll never happen in this country. It is happening in Estonia right now, but not here. So we've got a ways to go. I don't think there's an easy IT fix anytime soon, but we can improve the products and at least help our people do that job better. So thanks.
We'll wrap up there. Thank you very much. That wraps up our research and innovation session here. Just a couple of reminders. Again, we talked about in the beginning. A lot of you joined in soon afterwards. So at noon, there's a light lunch and clinical vignettes poster competition. Again, top advances in research and innovations, 11 a.m. to 5:10 p.m. in Baltimore. And look at your app for further information there. And again, keep tweeting as well. So again, join me in giving me a round of applause to these three presenters here. Thanks, everyone.
Hi there, how are you? When I realized I was speaking into that. Different stage directions.
No, it's so. How do you like to do it?
You guys are perfect. You guys are perfect. Good morning, everyone. If I could please ask you to take your seats, we're going to get started. Welcome to day 2 of HM19. What an energizing day yesterday. Inspired by Dr. Mark Harrison's compelling vision for the future and call to action. And then I don't know about you, but going to a couple of sessions yesterday, I definitely feel a lot more smart about my knowledge on hospital medicine. So hopefully you all had a chance to enjoy the sessions yesterday. And today we have another exciting day planned with our keynote speaker, Dr. Tate Shanafelt, and numerous sessions throughout the day. But first, we're going to acknowledge the stars of hospital medicine in our awards plenary session. And I'd like to start by recognizing our Chapter Excellence Awards. SHM has 65 chapters in the US and Canada and 4 international chapters. The high-performing chapters are honored here today, and they help achieve SHM's vision of providing exceptional care to hospitalized patients through extending SHM's reach to new members, providing network and education at the local level. The Chapter Excellence Awards are broken into 2 categories. The first being a tiered section where chapters can earn points by demonstrating how their chapter provides good hospital medicine citizenship, innovation, and sustainability. We have created 3 levels of achievement: silver, gold, and platinum. On the stage with me now, we have the chapter leaders who have helped take their SHM chapters to the next level. Please hold your applause until I have recognized all the chapters we are honoring today. I would like to ask our Silver Chapter Award winners to please step forward. Thank you all. I would like to ask the Gold Chapter winners to step forward. Thank you all. I'd like to ask our Platinum Chapter winners to step forward. Let's give our chapter winners a round of applause. Next, the Rising Star chapter recognizes the chapter that's made improvements to leadership, stability, and membership. I would like to ask the Knoxville chapter representatives to step forward. The recipient of the Rising Star Chapter Award for 2018 is the Knoxville chapter of SHM, which has made significant strides since its launch in spring of 2017. They assembled a group of local hospitalists from Knoxville and the surrounding region to encourage participation and drive quality initiatives in area hospitals. The Knoxville chapter developed a leadership framework, including officers and board members, and just completed their first formal chapter leadership election. In 2018, the chapter held 4 meetings, including an event steered towards residents and students. Membership in the chapter has grown more than 20% since its inception. The chapter has engaged in statewide quality initiatives with the Tennessee Hospital Association and has also engaged with other chapters across the state. Congratulations to the Knoxville chapter for being named SHM's Rising Star Chapter of 2018. SHM would like to highlight a chapter which exemplifies high performance, sustainability, and innovation with SHM's Outstanding Chapter of the Year. I would like to ask the Michigan chapter to step forward, please. The Michigan chapter continues to embrace the mission of our society and nurtures a vibrant and multidisciplinary membership. It is currently the largest chapter in the program, representing more than 750 SHM members. Using a technology-enabled platform, Michigan chapter has expanded its meetings to 4 different sites, leveraging expertise from across the state. The chapter recently held its largest meeting focused on provider burnout, with more than 100 attendees across 4 different sites. It featured a main speaker as well as a multidisciplinary panel of leaders from 8 different health systems. The chapter has successfully incorporated advocacy into its annual planning and actively responds to new legislation affecting hospital medicine. It continues to be an active and valued member of the Michigan medical community and the SHM chapter community at large. Congratulations to the Michigan chapter for receiving the SHM Outstanding Chapter of the Year Award 2018. And one last time, please join me in congratulating all of our SHM Chapter Excellence Award winners. Thank you all. Before we move on to SHM's Award of Excellence, I would like to take a moment to recognize Dr. Andy Auerbach for his 7 years of service to SHM as the editor-in-chief of Journal of Hospital Medicine, a role he held from 2011 to December of 2018. I would like to ask Dr. Auerbach to join me on stage. When Andy began, JHM managed approximately 350 papers annually and was published 10 times a year. Last year, the editorial team handled more than 700 papers, content that is now published monthly in print, as well as publishing articles online only and online first. Over the past 7 years, JHM added a robust presence on Facebook and Twitter and launched a Twitter journal club using the hashtag JHMChat. Dr. Auerbach has also overseen the introduction of 2 new series, Choosing Wisely, Next Steps in Choosing Wisely, Things We Do for No Reason, with help from the ABIM Foundation. Andy led his team to innovate and provide great service to JHM authors and the field of hospital medicine as a whole. This growth and forward-looking approach has put JHM on a strong path towards adapting to trends in hospital medicine and peer-reviewed publishing. He has further created a strong foundation for JHM and the society. Thank you so much, Andy. Please join me in congratulating Dr. Andy Auerbach. I would like to now present our Awards of Excellence. SHM's Awards of Excellence honor the very best hospitalists in hospital medicine, those individuals who have committed themselves to truly providing the best possible care for the hospitalized patient and moving our specialty forward. Most importantly, their dedication and innovation creates a path forward for thousands of other hospitalists, guiding us and empowering us to achieve the very best in our hospitals for our patients and our communities. As with many accomplishments in hospital medicine, these honors are rarely earned alone. I hope that you will join me in acknowledging the contributions of their colleagues, family members, and loved ones here today. We are also taking award submissions for next year, so please visit the SHM Pavilion in the exhibit hall or hospitalmedicine.org/awards for more information. I would like to present the Outstanding Service in Hospital Medicine, which goes to Dr. Kendall Rogers, and I would like to ask Dr. Rogers to join me on stage. Dr. Kendall Rogers is a professor and chief of the Division of Hospital Medicine at University of New Mexico Health Sciences Center, a group he founded 13 years ago. His national contributions to hospital medicine include promoting protected quality time for hospitalists, developing hospitalist leaders, promoting professionalism, and partnering with information technology vendors to improve design and innovations so that health IT may achieve its full potential. He has led numerous quality innovations that has led to improvement of patient care in many areas, including glycemic control, VTE prophylaxis, transitions of care, management of alcohol withdrawal. His role as lead mentor in SHM's Glycemic Control Mentored Implementation Program contributed to SHM receiving the 2011 Eisenberg Award from the National Quality Forum and the Joint Commission. He has been a strong advocate for advanced practice providers in hospital medicine and has championed and fostered the creation of hospital medicine APP fellowship at his institution. He has been a hands-on mentor to numerous early career hospitalists, both at his own institution and nationally. Dr. Rogers is a senior fellow in hospital medicine and has served on numerous SHM committees. He is regularly sought after as speaker on topics including quality improvement, leadership, professionalism, and clinical informatics. Please join me in congratulating Dr. Kendall Rogers for his outstanding service in hospital medicine. Our next award is Excellence in Research, and this year it goes to Dr. Tara Lagu. Dr. Lagu was not able to join us here today, but I would like to take a moment to recognize her many accomplishments. Dr. Lagu is the Associate Director of the Institute of Healthcare Delivery and Population Science and an Associate Professor at the University of Massachusetts Medical School at Bay State Medical Center. She has published 103 original peer-reviewed manuscripts in high-impact journals, including NEJM, JHM, and JAMA. Her research is primarily focused on improving the quality and value of care for patients with acute illness. She has published papers examining hospital care quality for patients with sepsis, ACS, pneumonia, and delirium, and has an R01 aimed at identifying strategies used by Medicare accountable care organizations to reduce admission rates for patients with heart failure. Dr. Lagu is also very interested in improving access to care for patients with disabilities. In 2013, she conducted a secret shopper survey of physicians in a variety of practice settings across the US and found that up to 20% of physicians nationwide refused to see a patient who used a wheelchair. This work was published in Annals of Internal Medicine and was profiled in the New York Times. Dr. Lagu is a senior fellow in hospital medicine and also serves as senior deputy editor for Journal of Hospital Medicine. Please join me in congratulating Dr. Tara Lagu for her Excellence in Research Award. Our next award is our Clinical Leadership for Physicians, and this year's award goes to Dr. Harry Cho. I would like to ask Dr. Cho to join me on stage. Dr. Harry Cho is an academic hospitalist and the inaugural Chief Value Officer at NYC Health and Hospital Health Systems, the largest public health system in the US, serving more than 1.4 people annually. They say 1.4 million people annually. Wow. Congratulations. In his previous role as the Director of Quality, Safety, and Value at Mount Sinai Hospital, he founded and led the hospital's high-value care team, eventually leading more than 90 faculty, residents, and students in initiatives across health systems to improve costs and outcomes. Nationally, he has demonstrated tremendous leadership as chair of SHM's High-Value Care Subcommittee and by leading the development of the next SHM Choosing Wisely list through collaboration with patient advocates and clinicians across the country. He is an active member of SHM's HQPS committee and the chapter support committee in the past, and he has been on the editorial board of the Hospitalist. Since he became a Hospitalist, he has received over 50 awards and recognitions for his work in value-based care and quality, and has spoken at over 40 lectures and workshops nationwide. He has published widely in peer-reviewed journals, including Journal of Hospital Medicine, Journal of General Internal Medicine, and JAMA Internal Medicine. Please join me in congratulating Dr. Harry Cho for his work to promote clinical leadership in hospital medicine. Our next award is the Excellence in Teaching, and it goes to Dr. Chris Moreland. If I could ask Dr. Moreland to please join me on stage. Dr. Chris Moreland is an associate professor of medicine and hospitalist at University of Texas Health, San Antonio, where he also serves as associate residency program director. He has established himself as a well-respected clinical educator, an innovator, and an administrator committed to seeing medical students and residents advance their abilities. In 2011, he collaborated with the UT Health faculty development specialist to develop and direct a month-long resident as teacher elective, which has since been extremely popular. His other innovations have included a resident medical Spanish elective, a teaching track for residents, and communication-focused critical care simulation, and trilingual interpretation of OSCE for medical students. Some of his peer-reviewed publications have addressed medical schools' technical standards and the next iteration of ACGME milestones for residents. Being deaf himself, Chris continually mentors deaf residents and healthcare students across North America and advised educators working with trainees with disability. He published the first formal study of a subpopulation for physicians and students with disability, hearing loss, in 2013. He is also a fellow in hospital medicine. Chris, I want to say congratulations, and if I could ask you all to please congratulate Chris with an applause with sign language. Our next award of excellence is in clinical leadership for nurse practitioners and physician assistants, and this year it goes to Lorraine Britting. If I could ask Lorraine Britting to please join me up on stage. Lorraine Britting is the clinical director of advanced practice providers in cardiology medicine and a practicing acute care nurse practitioner at the Cardiovascular Institute at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston. She has overseen the growth of the program from 8 to 32 advanced practice providers in the last decade. Her efforts extend across the medical center by creating and chairing multiple committees designed to address credentialing, billing, reimbursement, and recruitment issues specific to APPs. Within SHM, Lorraine has served as an invaluable member of the MPPA committee, the HQPS committee, membership committee, and as peer review for Journal of Hospital Medicine. She is a senior fellow in hospital medicine. Please join me in congratulating Lorraine Britting and her excellence in hospital medicine for nurse practitioners and physician assistants. Our next award is Excellence in Humanitarian Services, and it goes to Dr. Chris Olson. If I could ask Dr. Olson to join me on stage. Dr. Olson is an internist and a pediatrician and has been an academic hospitalist member of the core educator faculty in the Department of Medicine at Massachusetts General Hospital since its founding in 2005. He's also the director of the Consortium for Affordable Medical Technologies, also known as CAMTech. In 2005, he worked in Darfur before being contracted by the European Commission for Humanitarian Organizations to train birth attendants in rural Sumatra following the Asian tsunami. For the next 5 years, Dr. Olson work resulted in creation of a network of over 350 midwives still in existence who retrain each other in newborn resuscitation and postpartum hemorrhage 3 times per year. He's an inventor and a developer of the Augmented Infant Resuscitator, a device that enables birth attendants to achieve effective ventilation in less than half the time and maintain it for 50% longer. In 2009, he was instrumental in setting up Ethiopia's first multi-drug-resistant tuberculosis treatment program, where he developed care processes and attended to patients with active TB. By 2012, more than 1,000 patients had completed therapy with unparalleled rates of success. Work through Dr. Olson's CAMTech Open Innovation Platform has empowered people the tools to solve their own medical challenges, principally in India, Uganda, and the United States. By reaching across disciplines, he's been able to align frontline health providers to work with patients, engineers, designers, policymakers, public health practitioners to make more sustainable solutions to the challenges we face in healthcare. This platform has attracted over 4,300 innovators, has led to over 100 innovations being trialed and over 30 companies formed and 40 patents filed. Please join me in congratulating Dr. Chris Olson for his excellence in humanitarian services. I have to say, I don't feel very good about myself after going through all of these awards. All right, our next award is our Excellence in Management, and this year's award goes to Stephanie Perry. If I could ask Stephanie Perry to please join me on stage. Stephanie Perry, currently the Director of Hospital Medicine Services at Virginia Mason Medical Center in Seattle, is a leader in building sustainability into the work of hospitalists. While at Virginia Mason, she developed an internal auditing and education platform to improve revenue cycle opportunities, which brought over $500,000 in additional gross revenue to the organization in 2018. Stephanie also created a structured onboarding platform for hospitalists and created a new flexible scheduling method to improve the team's work-life balance. In partnership with her leadership team, Stephanie has improved hospitalist engagement scores by 29% over the past 3 years, with 86% of physicians rating as engaged employees. This has resulted in 0 attrition since July of 2017. She is a senior fellow in hospital medicine and a true leader in her field. Please join me in congratulating Stephanie Perry. Our next award goes to Excellence in Teamwork and Quality Improvement, and it goes to the Mount Sinai Hospital High Value Care Team. If I could ask the team to please join me up on stage. Yeah. The Mount Sinai Hospital's High Value Care Team is a multidisciplinary group focused on reducing overuse, decreasing costs throughout the institution, and allowing clinicians to focus on providing outstanding care and developing relationships with their patients. Founded by Dr. Harry Cho, who's here representing the team today along with the team, the High Value Care Team has chosen projects that have meaningfully impacted waste reduction in patient care. They have created a sustainable structure engaging multiple members of the care team, including staff, trainees, and students. Its collaborative environment in and on itself demonstrates high value, and it has helped improve staff satisfaction and retention. The team has focused on areas identified as wasteful by SHM as part of ABIM's Choosing Wisely initiative. Projects have decreased lab testing, including amylase, folate, and routine lab tests, as well as medications such as docosate. Additionally, the team has tackled telemetry and urinary catheters and has improved patient mobility and inpatient sleep. Their innovative work can help speak to similar programs nationally. As a result, the team has created reduced wasteful practices, decreased costs, and allowed clinicians to focus on providing outstanding care and developing relationships with their patients. In addition to many hospitalists, the High Value Care Team consists of members from Mount Sinai's nursing, pharmacy, laboratory, and IT departments, including Dr. Andrew Dunn, Dr. Beth Rocher, Dr. John McClaskey, Nicole Wells, Suzanne Kushney, Surafel Siga, and Gina Caliendo. Please join me in congratulating the Mount Sinai Hospital High Value Care Team for its excellence in quality improvement as a team. Thank you all. Thank you. Congratulations. Our next award is for our Junior Investigator Award for Dr. On Wen. While Dr. Wen could not join us today, I would like to take a moment to review her many accomplishments. Dr. Wen is an assistant professor in the Division of Hospital Medicine at University of California, San Francisco. Her research is focused on understanding and optimizing hospital care in safety net settings and pragmatic approaches to addressing the social determinants of health and transitional care strategies that address coexisting social vulnerabilities. Her current work, funded through a K-23 award, seeks to develop a strategy to predict, understand, and address coexisting social vulnerabilities among adults hospitalized with congestive heart failure and ischemic heart disease who are at high risk for readmission. While she's early in her investigative career, she already has 32 peer review publications with another 4 first author manuscripts under review in preparation. She is an associate editor for Journal of Hospital Medicine. We'd like to congratulate her for her many accomplishments. I would like to take a moment and recognize our 2018 Student Hospitalist Scholar Grant recipients. SHM is proud to acknowledge the latest winners of the Scholar Grant Program. These medical students were awarded scholarship grants to complete scholarly work with an active SHM mentor in a project related to patient safety, quality improvement, or other areas relevant to the field of hospital medicine. I would like to ask you to join me in congratulating our grant recipients. I would also like to congratulate the latest winners of our SHM Resident Travel Grant winners. To qualify for this award, these residents submitted an abstract for consideration in the RIV session at HM19 as first authors. Each of them produced outstanding work worthy of recognition. And I'd like to ask you to join me to congratulate these outstanding residents. I would now like to invite to the stage the incoming president of Society of Hospital Medicine, Chris Frost, who will introduce our keynote speaker for today.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Tate Shanafelt. Dr. Shanafelt is the Chief Wellness Officer, Associate Dean, and Jeannie and Stuart Ritchie Professor of Medicine at Stanford University. Dr. Shanafelt is a hematologist-oncologist whose clinical work focuses on the care of patients with chronic lymphocytic leukemia. He is a member of the National Cancer Institute Leukemia Steering Committee and is currently the principal investigator on 3 R01 grants from the NCI. He has been the principal investigator on numerous clinical trials testing new treatments for patients with CLL, including 2 national phase 3 trials for the Eastern Cooperative Oncology Group, ECOG. He has published more than 350 peer-reviewed manuscripts and commentaries, in addition to more than 100 abstracts and book chapters. In addition to his leukemia research, Dr. Shanafelt is an international thought leader and researcher in the field of clinician well-being and its implications for quality of care. His pioneering studies in this area nearly 20 years ago are credited with helping launch the entire field of organizational efforts to promote clinician well-being. He previously served as the founding director of the Mayo Clinic Department of Medicine program on physician well-being and served a 3-year term as the president of the Mayo Clinic voting staff. In 2017, he moved to Stanford, where he now leads the WellMD Center. He is a member of the National Academy of Medicine Committee on System Approaches to Support Clinician Well-Being. He has helped hundreds of organizations and their leaders work to improve burnout and promote professional fulfillment for clinicians. Dr. Shanafelt has published more than 120 scientific manuscripts on this topic and has served as a keynote speaker to the AMA, ACGME, AAMC, and ABIM. His studies in this area have also been cited in USA Today, the New York Times, as well as CNN. In 2018, he was named by Time magazine as one of the 50 most influential people in healthcare. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shanafelt, who will share thoughts on how to avoid burnout and find meaning, balance, and personal satisfaction in the practice. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, Thank you for that kind introduction. It's great to be with you this morning and to look at this topic relevant to all of us in our professional experience. Always like to begin by acknowledging the team in the WellMD Center at Stanford, and also always like to acknowledge Dr. Lottie Derby, Dr. Colin West, two of my colleagues in general internal medicine at Mayo Clinic who have been partners in this work for nearly 20 years. I always introduce the topic to you in this way, which is that if I were to propose that we had a system issue in our healthcare delivery system across the US, in our organizations, hospitals, medical centers, that was eroding quality of care, undermining patient satisfaction, and reducing access to care, and that it was such a pervasive problem in the system that it may in one form or another impact up to 40 to 50% of the patients that we were going to care for today. You can imagine the type of response that would occur, not just in our organizations, but nationally. Our legislators would be having hearings, our CEOs, our deans would be in front of their boards within 48 hours asking for an update on the problem, what we understood about it, what the organizational plan to address it was, and what the frequency and cadence of updates to the board was going to be. And what I would suggest to you is we've had precisely that type of an issue, a system problem in the healthcare delivery system. It's having those effects. We've known about it. We haven't responded to it the way we would respond to other system issues. What's happening to doctors? And on a societal level, folks look at us and think we have this recipe for personal and professional fulfillment. Highly educated, universally employed, well compensated relative to most professions. We engage in work that people believe matters, taking care of our fellow human beings when they're ill. And it should be meaningful and rewarding work. And yet these are the headlines from our own medical journals over the last 20 years, telling a different story about our experience. I know we also have many advanced practice providers in the audience, much less known about the experience of physician assistants, and nurse practitioners, but the limited data we have suggests that this is a pervasive problem for you as well. So our day-to-day experience often doesn't match that external perception. If we think about or look at the burnout syndrome specifically, this is one of the dimensions of distress we experience. There are others, such as fatigue and loss of meaning and purpose in work, other occupational forms of distress. But I like to always be clear how many use this term. Burnout is this occupational syndrome. It is not a mental health issue. It is characterized by exhaustion, cynicism, and a loss of the sense that your work is making a difference. And all of us have those feelings to some frequency and severity. When they begin to come too often and to too severe an extent, they undermine your effectiveness in work. Differs from the global impairment of depression. It relates to your relationship with your professional sphere of life. It primarily affects individuals whose work involves intense interactions with other people, teachers, social workers, police officers, nurses, and physicians. And the fundamental premise is that it is not due to any character flaw or problem in the individual. It's due to characteristics in the system and work environment. There are tens of thousands of articles going back 45 years looking at this syndrome from the field of occupational science, population-level data across all professions in a number of countries, including now the US. So this is not something specific just to medicine, although we as healthcare providers are at high risk. What does burnout look like in the US? We'll move through this quickly. This is data familiar to all of you. Prior to 2011, we just had large single specialty experiences, single medical center experiences. This was the first national look across all specialties and practice settings. And using the gold standard instrument at that time, 45% of US physicians had at least one symptom of burnout. You note the wide variation by specialty, with many of our specialties at the front line of access to the healthcare delivery system at the top of that list: emergency medicine, general internal medicine, family medicine. At the time of that study, we also simultaneously looked at a true probability-based sample of US workers in all other fields. The comparison here is physicians and workers aged 29 to 65 actively employed at the time of the survey. You note the physicians worked on average 10 hours more per week than workers in other fields. The average in hours here is a bit misleading or only tells part of the story because the tails of the distribution are very different. So in this study, 44% of physicians were working more than 60 hours per week as compared to 7% of workers in other fields. I'd like to emphasize that last point. I think we often project that in 2018 or 2019, everybody's working high number of hours. That's just life as a professional in today's world. And that's just fundamentally not true. That's life as a physician. It's very rare for workers in other fields to work more than 60 hours per week. Burnout, using an abbreviated version of the tool, we had the full-length version in the docs, the abbreviated in the population, so this is an apples-to-apples comparison with the abbreviated. Burnout, more common in the docs. There was no difference in rates of depression. The distress in physicians was specific to occupational distress, not other forms of distress, and physicians twice as likely to be dissatisfied with work-life integration as workers in other fields. With this big sample, we could look across all these workers independent of their job type and explore factors associated with the risk of burnout. Age is a protective factor. So every year you are older reduces your risk about 1.5%, 10 years older, 15% lower risk. I always emphasize here, that's not a generational effect. The first question from the audience always is that millennials entering the physician workforce? At the time of this study, there were no millennials in the physician workforce in 2011. They were in residency and fellowship. And this observation of younger workers being at higher risk is true inside and outside medicine and has been true in every study that's ever really looked at this for the last 30 years. This was true in 1990. And it has more to do with the complexity of life earlier in a career, establishing yourself in your job, trying to make your way, younger relationships on the personal front, younger children at home. Marriage protective, every hour you work increases risk 2%, 10 additional hours, 20% higher risk. And what was the striking and fundamental observation in this study was the protective effect of education. And the theory would say as you're pursuing an advanced degree, you're self-selecting a field that you find interesting, you're acquiring additional skill and expertise, and when you complete that training, you're likely going to be more fulfilled in your work because you selected it and you're a high-skill worker. And indeed, that's true. So relative to those with a high school diploma, a bachelor's degree reduces your risk 20%, master's degree reduces risk 30%, doctoral level degree in a field outside of medicine reduces risk 40%. This is the adjusted analysis controlling for differences in hours worked. So pick your profession. Lawyers do burn out, but it's largely driven by the high number of hours they work. The notable outlier here, and completely counter to the protective effect of education in other fields, and after adjusting for the high number of hours we work, is physicians. I can tell you we have national data coming out now from a national study with the American Nurses Association. This is not true in nurses. And when we do a separate analysis comparing physicians to PhD level workers in other fields, this gap still persists. This is specific to physicians. What is the trend line since 2011? We look every 3 years in collaboration with the AMA at physicians and workers in other fields. It was unfortunately just a bleak story that we had to tell with the 2014 update, a 10% increase in burnout and further decrement in work-life integration. We published about 3 weeks ago the update from the end of 2017, early 2018, showing that there's actually been a modest improvement in burnout and work-life integration over the last 3 years for physicians, but we still have this very wide gap relative to workers in other fields. What about your work as hospitalists? We looked at this as a study led by my colleague Daniel Roberts at Mayo Clinic, and using the 2011 data, we looked at the experience of hospital-based internal medicine physicians relative to general internal medicine physicians in the outpatient setting. Hospitalists worked 5 hours more per week on average. You'll note that the emotional exhaustion scores, depersonalization scores, and overall burnout scores were equivalent between the inpatient and outpatient internal medicine-based physicians, the hospitalists had lower personal accomplishment scores. They were, despite the higher number of hours, a bit more satisfied with work-life integration. So overall, what was interesting, I think to many of us, was that it's just very different work, and that there was no difference in the overall rates of burnout, but some of the factors that contributed to it were very different based on your practice experience. And building on that theme, I show you this data with work-life integration on a y-axis, burnout on an x-axis. The intersecting lines here are the average for US physician. The dots are specialties. You don't have to be able to read them all. The couple points from this slide are that we tend to think these things are always going to travel together, that you're going to be satisfied in both domains or dissatisfied in both domains. And indeed, the specialties in the green box and the red box, that's the case. But it's not a absolute truth. You note the emergency medicine physicians in the right upper quadrant have the highest rate of burnout of any specialty by a substantial margin. But they also are very satisfied with work-life integration. And if you look in that lower left quadrant, by a very large margin, neurosurgeons are the most dissatisfied with work-life integration, but they have below average rates of burnout. You'll also note in the red quadrant that we have one of the highest paid specialties, orthopedic surgery, and one of the lowest paid specialties, family medicine, right next to each other. This is not about money. And I show this slide to illustrate that every specialty has a profile. When we replace the y-axis with a different dimension, such as fatigue or meaning in work, all the dots shuffle again. And the takeaway here is that every discipline, yours included, has the unique challenges specific to that specialty area of medicine. And you need to understand that profile of what it is that's challenging about your work as a hospitalist, because it's a different challenge. What the emergency medicine physicians here need and want is different than what the neurosurgeons need and want. And we don't make progress by ignoring that fact. We need to address those unique challenges for each discipline. Last slide on sort of state of the problem. When does burnout start? I always jokingly hear say, but they've actually said this, that there are people who propose that we administer, Angela Duckworth's grit index as a part of the medical school application process, and select different people into medicine who are less likely to burn out. The problem is that we're already doing that. So in this study, we looked at matriculating medical students. We compared them to their college graduate peers going into other fields. At the time of matriculation, the medical students have less burnout, less depression, better mental health in every domain we assessed. So we're already selecting very resilient people. Then we, as educators, had our hands on them for 2 years. And the profile's completely reversed. So higher burnout, higher depression, lower mental health in every dimension. In our largest studies of internal medicine residents, when we put these items on the in-training exam and had over 90% of the internal medicine residents in the United States complete these assessments, over 16,000 internal medicine residents, 75% of residents experienced burnout at some point during their training, strongly correlated with their medical knowledge scores, equivalent to a whole year of training. So an R3 who was burned out had a medical knowledge score of an R2, and on longitudinal follow-up, that gap was never closed. And once we're in practice, our time of peak risk is mid-career, 10 to 20 years into a career, and this is probably in part as we master things, the things that used to be very motivating, create that spark of interest for you, sort of lose their luster. You need to find new challenges to keep yourself growing personally and professionally. So why should we care? This is a half-hour talk that we're going to do basically in one slide, because you're all familiar with this. Obviously, we care because there are personal repercussions that we either have personally experienced or that we've observed in colleagues. I always find it very disturbing that we have an occupational syndrome that we're at higher risk for than other professions that increases your risk of divorce, increases your risk of problematic alcohol use, national studies, increases the risk of depression, and increases our risk of suicide. As you no doubt know, male physicians relative to white-collar male professionals in other fields, the physicians are at 50% higher risk of death by suicide. And for our women colleagues, depending on which study you read, their risk of death by suicide relative to women professionals in other fields is 200 to 300%. And what we've seen in these studies is that burnout is an independent predictor of suicidal thoughts, independent of depression, dose effect. Every 1 point change in burnout on these 50-point scales increases your risk of suicidal thoughts. In the 3 months after you perceive you've made a major medical error, which is intrinsic to our work, no one goes through a career and doesn't think at some point in time that they made a mistake, whether it's accurate or not. That doubles your risk of suicide in the 3 months after you perceive you've made an error. So we have these occupational risks for suicide. But historically, administrative leaders would look at the left side of that slide and say, you know, you chose this work. If you don't like it, that's tough. Show up and do the work. And nobody is better at showing up and doing the work than physicians and other healthcare professionals. But the problem is it has these professional consequences with increased risk of medical errors, lower quality of care, decreased patient satisfaction, increased rates of unsolicited patient complaints to the ombudsman, people coming in saying that they were treated rudely and unprofessionally. We have data from Stanford, my colleague Dana Welly, showing that there's increased medical malpractice litigation risk prospectively after a physician experiences burnout. And we now have data from Stanford, Cleveland Clinic, and UCSF showing that physicians who are burned out have roughly double the actual departure rate from the institution than those who are not burned out. And at Stanford, when this data was reported in 2015, where we looked at our physicians in 2013, if they were burned out, came back in 2015, doubled the departure rate, and the CFO of the School of Medicine looked at the cost to Stanford of the incremental amount of burnout due to turnover, having to recruit and replace those faculty. Depending on how liberal or conservative she was in her assumptions, the cost was $15 to $65 million per year to the School of Medicine, just for the turnover part, not the productivity, the quality, the patient satisfaction scores. So large economic cost. And I think the other piece that's disturbing here is that this can be an infectious phenomena. And we all remember this from our training days. You would be working with one team and then you would rotate to a different specialty and you would suddenly get embedded with a group of other residents or fellows that was jaded and cynical. And you were going to have to live with that team for a month. And that was going to have an effect on your experience over the next month. And so that once it affects a critical mass, it can be transmitted to other members of the care team. What's causing this problem? We do need to understand this because we have to address these things to make a difference. And I won't read all these things to you. They're part of our daily experience of some of the changes in medicine over the last decade. The one I do always emphasize is the one at the bottom of the isolation. And, you know, this has always been emotionally demanding work. This has always been a challenging profession. That has been true for hundreds of years. You know, one of the things that has always gotten us through is the amazing colleagues that we have, the people sitting to your left and to your right. Incredibly altruistic, dedicated people, self-sacrificing, hard workers, care about their fellow human beings. And we always supported each other in this work. And as we're now moving faster, productivity higher, more time spent on clerical work, more time documenting, we are interacting with our colleagues less. And that's frayed the fabric that's always seen us through some of the challenges that we deal with. The EHR is usually the first thing on the tip of everyone's lips of what's causing this. You're probably all familiar with Krasinski's seminal time motion study in which she followed cardiologists, orthopedic surgeons, family medicine, general internists with direct observation for several months and found that half of the average physician's workday is now spent on desktop medicine, and that even in the exam room, increasingly the experience is depicted by that picture. And what I'd emphasize there is that the EHR is fundamentally much more than just clicks and clerical burden and time spent documenting. It's fundamentally changing the human-human interaction that we have with our patients. That's one of the things that has always given us meaning in our work. So it's more than just the hours, but the hours are not inconsequential. So the best data using Epic timestamps from the University of Wisconsin has found that the average physician now spends 28 hours a month on nights and weekends when they're not on duty completing their clinical documentation. Almost an entire hidden week of work every month completing your clinical documentation. But this is, to some extent, I often refer to it as the visible dragon. And in our national studies, only about 20% of the relative risk of burnout has anything to do with the EHR. And there are many other things about our work that are changing. Medical knowledge is exploding. Increased productivity, quality metrics, patient satisfaction scores, MOC. These are all, or at least behind these things, are good intentions. We want competent, up-to-date physicians. We want medical knowledge to grow, but we have to keep abreast of it, and that's one more thing on our personal time. Give a shout out to Dr. Liz Harry, who's here in the audience today from Mass General, had an excellent poster last night from the last national study looking at cognitive load, which is another field of occupational science that we have not applied to medicine, but Liz now has applied this and has looked at measuring cognitive load in physicians across specialties and how all of these interruptions and these different dimensions of the cognitive burden of our work is also a major driver of burnout, and I think also gives us a different way to think about how we might intervene and act, and gives us a new metric by which we can chart improvement. Now, some have suggested that we do bring some personality traits with us that put us at increased risk. They refer to this as the triad of compulsiveness, not flattering for us, doubt, guilt, and an exaggerated sense of personal responsibility. But what they suggest here is that how would it look any different? Medicine is an inexact science. There will be doubt. We take the trust our patients place in us seriously. And if things don't go well, we're constantly asking ourselves, could we have done better? And that doesn't mean that there was a mistake. I'm an oncologist. If I see a patient back for cycle 4 of chemotherapy and cycle 3, they experienced excess toxicity, I'll be asking myself, should I have been able to predict that? Should I have dose reduced? Should I have delayed that cycle? And depending on characteristics of the patient, if they were a young patient and the toxicity was particularly egregious, that might stay with me for weeks. Should I have done better? Could I have done better? And what the psychologists suggest is that these are the very qualities that actually make you a good physician. You would want the person taking care of your own loved one to have these traits. But while they're adaptive for us in some settings, they're maladaptive for us in other settings. Like when you're at home on Friday night trying to enjoy some time with your family, and your mind is still at work because of these traits. So helpful in some settings, challenging in others. The last piece I'll touch on, and then we'll turn our eye toward where do we go from here, is this study from the University of Washington, Christian Helfrich and his team at the Seattle VA, looking at the primary care teams in the VAs across the US, and I think another seminal paper. And Christian and team looked at all members of the primary care teams. At the VA, there are 4 members of primary care teams. There's a physician or a nurse practitioner at the top of each team. There's a RN, an LPN, and a medical assistant. Target panel size for physician-led teams, 1,400 patients. Nurse practitioner-led teams, 900 patients. And they measured a whole host of characteristics about how those teams work together. I'm just showing you a handful. They looked at burnout, most common in the docs, but common in other members of the care team as well. And what they found is that there were 3 characteristics that predicted burnout for all members of the care team. Whether all 4 of the positions were filled, whether there'd been turnover in any of the 4 slots, and whether the panel size the team was caring for was above or below capacity, and those characteristics were independent and had a cumulative effect as they aggregated on the whole team. And the reason I think this study is so important is it perfectly illustrates the system nature of this problem. So I asked the question, did the nurse that you have had as a member of your team leave your hospital in the last 6 months to move back to where he or she was from, move back to Chicago? And if that happened, you and every member of your team just became at increased risk for burnout. And if you haven't been able to replace them because there's a nursing shortage, you're at even higher risk. And if you're on a different team that's trying to help out that short-staffed team and having to take a few extra patients, now you and your whole team are at increased risk. You were eating right, you were sleeping, you were exercising, you were practicing good self-care, both before and after your nurse chose to move back to Chicago. But you're at increased risk for burnout because of the characteristics of the work environment that you have no control over. And it raises the question of why do we give this man a hard hat and ear protection? And it's because in his job, stuff falls on his head. And what I would propose to you is that burnout is the sine qua non occupational injury of being a physician. And what is the equivalent of the protective gear that we as organizations are providing our people so that they can stay maximally engaged in their work and continue to provide good care for patients? And we haven't approached the problem in this way. What can we do as individuals? I'm only going to show you 2 slides here because this is a separate talk. It's not our focus today. And there are many things we can do. I do like to fundamentally emphasize we are not victims and we are not powerless to address this problem, and that there are things and choices that we can do, even though this is primarily a system issue. And I usually think about them simplistically in these 3 ways of identifying your personal and professional values. Typically for physicians, if you make a list of the things that matter most to you and the things you want to accomplish personally and a separate list of what you want to accomplish professionally, I always say I don't know what's on your 2 lists, but I can guarantee your 2 lists are incompatible. And you have to be very deliberate in thinking about how you're going to make trade-offs to meet both of those priority lists. And I use the example there, I'm a leukemia researcher, and if I want to be an expert in my field, but also think that I'm never going to miss a soccer game, those are unrealistic expectations. I do miss soccer games to present at national meetings, sit on a study section, finish a manuscript or a grant, and make a difference for the patients I've dedicated my career to. But the question is, how many soccer games is it okay to miss and still have the relationship with my kids that I aspire to? And you and your partner both need to feel good about what that integrated list looks like. The second piece here is optimizing meaning in work. I'll show you 1 slide on that. And then this last piece of the self-care activities do make a difference. So we do need to engage in these things, even though they're not the primary solution to the problem. And I think we need to address that hyper self-criticism that kind of comes with the physician personality. Colleague Mickey Trockle has, I think, another critical piece coming out on what a major role that plays in our professional experience as physicians, that hyper self-criticism and how we're more compassionate with colleagues than we are with ourselves. But coming to that meaning in work piece, in this study we looked at 450 internal medicine physicians. We asked them what was the most meaningful aspect of work, and then we measured how they spent their time. And what we found is that if you spent less than 20% time in that activity that's what is most meaningful to you, your risk of burnout is very high. So the far left bars are people who are spending less than 5 or 5 to 10% time in that most meaningful area. Their burnout risk is 50 to 60%. As they spend 10 to 20% time in that most meaningful area, their burnout drops into the mid-30s, and as you spend more than 20% time, your burnout risk dips under 30, and the remaining 30% was explained by work hours, specialty, call schedule, et cetera. But did you or did you not have at least 20% time in that area that's most meaningful to you? Was the single biggest predictor of burnout in the multivariate. And what was notable here is that there was a threshold phenomena So once you had 20% time in that most meaningful area, there was no benefit to going higher with respect to reducing your risk of burnout. I always say here that I want to spend 100% of my time on the stuff that I like most, and I work hard to spend more time there. But the part you must have is 20%. And every 1% below 20, your risk of burnout starts increasing dramatically. And what I find from the application, having asked thousands of physicians, what's that most meaningful area for you right now? That I can count on two hands the number of physicians who on the spot could give me a very specific and granular answer. I usually get the I like taking care of patients answer, and I always say, you hate that. You hate charting in the EHR, and you hate battling the insurance companies and getting a pre-authorization for their imaging. If you're an outpatient doc, you hate that extra patient, or even if for you, that emergency that comes up at the end of your shift and you end up having to stay late and you miss your kid's recital or whatever it might be. What part of taking care of patients do you like? And then you might get down to some really specific things, and it might be certain diseases, it might be certain demographics that people like taking care of, it might be leadership, mentorship, teaching, education, quality improvement, you name it. It can be many things. And until you know what it is, you can't really take stock of how much time you're spending there, how you might grow that activity, what training or other experiences you would need to do that. So this is an important thing for us all to reflect on. But turning our eye toward the rest of the talk, if this is a system issue, what are we doing as healthcare organizations? And I always show this image to make the point that the fella on the left does not need to be taught mindfulness. He's very aware of the moment. And he's been training hard, he's been exercising, he's been eating right, he has a professional coach, he's been doing all of those things. And fundamentally, what he needs is a better work environment. I show this slide because I think in the minds of many administrators, they think this is what physicians want. And I refer to this as the zero-sum game mindset of addressing this problem. And it's the belief that the only way to make progress is that we have to reduce productivity targets or lower the census per team, and that in today's reimbursement structure and narrow margins, we can't do that. Therefore, we wish we could do something, but there's nothing we can do. And I'm going to tell you in a minute why this is not a zero-sum game problem. This is the Stanford model on professional fulfillment developed by my colleague Brian Bowman, and you note that the bullseye here is not eradication of burnout, it's something more aspirational of creating the environment that cultivates high professional fulfillment. And we have been talking about some of those things that we do for ourselves, that blue area, and that's important, but the other two areas are red because the other two legs of this stool are Stanford's responsibility. And when we talk about a culture of wellness, I think the first thing that many people think about is healthy food in the cafeteria, a gym, and a culture where everybody exercises. And I make the point that that's not an organizational culture of wellness, that's an organizational culture of personal resilience. And an organizational culture of wellness relates to these types of things. What's the leadership behaviors of the leaders across the organization? What's the alignment of the values and priorities of the organization with the altruistic values of the profession? Do we give our people meaning and voice and flexibility and control? Do we support each other? These types of dimensions. And on the efficiency of practice front, we often get fixated on the EHR, and that's a tougher nut to crack than some of these other variables. There are many other factors in your daily workflows and processes. I don't know the one for you, but you can probably pick something, the way an admission comes up to you out of the emergency room, or a transfer happens, that have nothing necessarily to do with the EHR, but can be very depleting in because of the way they're currently executed. And those things often offer greater opportunity. When we try to think about where do we act as organizations to make progress, we often think about these 7 areas: workload, efficiency, flexibility and control, meaning in work, culture and values alignment, community at work, and an environment that facilitates work-life integration. And to the extent these are suboptimal, the environment pushes us toward burnout, more optimal pushes toward engagement. And I want you to cast your mind back to the physician with his feet on the desk. And, I moved to Stanford about 1.5 years ago, and so you're the new person, and all the picadillos of any organization's culture are readily apparent to you, the things you become blind to over time. And it was very interesting to me that anytime a rating system at Stanford comes out, US News, you name it, we don't really care whether we're number 1 or not. That's important. But the most important thing is, are we above or below UCSF? So there are these 2 great academic centers within 30 miles of each other, both in the same region of the country. And I would propose you pretend you're a hospitalist and you have a job offer at these 2 places, and that's where you want to practice, is in that area at an academic center. And the productivity expectations, however you measure it, the workload at the 2 places is identical. But one of the 2 places attends to the other 6 hexagons and the other does not. And they try to optimize those and the other does not. Which of the 2 places do you want to work? And that's why this is not a zero-sum game. And there are many opportunities beyond just changing the productivity expectations that organizations can act on. And when we think about how you apply these different dimensions, we need to apply them at individual, work unit, organization, and then bigger than organization levels. The example here is to think about efficiency. Not all the oncologists in my group are equally efficient. All of the oncologists in my group, their efficiency is affected by how we triage, schedule chemotherapy, what our workflows are. The whole hospital system is affected by which EHR we use, how we interpret policies and regulations about various factors. And then there are factors bigger than Stanford, insurance pre-authorization, that influences my efficiency. And so there's factors at all levels. And we've mostly spent the last decade blaming individuals. And probably the greatest opportunities lie in these middle 2 domains, particularly the department level. These are 9 strategies we published about 2.5 years ago of things organizations can do. This is not intended to be a comprehensive list. It's just 9 that we had good evidence for at the time, and we need to continue to expand this list. And I'm only going to highlight a couple of these for you. The first one I'll touch on is probably the longest lever we have. It's the critical role that leadership plays. And in this study, we looked at 130 physician leaders, mainly division chiefs or section chiefs, clinic chiefs. We evaluated their behavior. We had their people that reported to them, the physicians reporting to them, evaluate their behavior on this instrument. It wasn't, do you like them? It was, how often does the leader do this? How often does the leader do that? Generated a 60-point score. What we found is every 1-point change on that 60-point score impacted the burnout rate and professional fulfillment rate of the physicians under their leadership, independent of all other factors. And that what was more telling is when we looked at these 130 units and controlled for what we could, 11% of the variation between in burnout between units was explained by the leader score. But more striking, half of the professional satisfaction of the people, of whether they were happy working in this organization, was explained by the leadership score of the most junior leader in the organization. And I always say that this really rattled our cage in the C-suite at Mayo Clinic, because when we thought about how much time at the top of the house you spend thinking about strategy and what we're going to pay people, how much, in what form, what benefits are we going to provide, how are we attending to our culture and all of these other variables, and how all of those things together are half the battle. And the other half is the behavior of the most junior leader in the organization to which people report. And we typically don't provide those folks much development as a leader. It's the more senior leaders that get developed. And so this is a huge opportunity. Allowing people to fix the local broken windows or the local, pebble in your shoe is also critical. In this study, we took those same 130 units, we identified the 22 who had the highest levels of burnout and lowest satisfaction. We would engage them in a couple focus groups, and we would first give them 5 minutes to blame the CEO about all the world's problems, world hunger. And you have to do that to let people blow off steam about the things above the unit that are really the cosmic problems like EPIC. But then we would say, let's spend the rest of this time focusing on the things under your sphere of control, the local things in your work unit that could change, you name it, scheduling, triage, workflows, fairness in how weekends and call are assigned and all other things. We would show them those hexagons and we would say, which of those domains is the biggest challenge for you, and then help us understand how does that manifest in your area. This work-life integration is a problem. What does that look like in your unit, or the loss of control? We would then ask the leader to meet back with the group, say, this is, thank you for the feedback, here's what we heard, we have a lot to work on, this was the domain people wanted to work on, I've assigned Jennifer to lead a task force if you would like to take a crack at a better way, partner with her, we would operationalize it and assess whether it worked. And what we found is that every unit is unique. If we have a room of hospitalists here, there's not one problem in this room. There are dozens of problems about some places have figured out the thing that really grinds your gears, and they might have a different challenge. And that every unit we've taken through this process has had an improvement in burnout across many organizations. Most have an improvement in satisfaction. And it's not because every one of the intervention works, because they unequivocally don't always have the intended effect. But the process works because it communicates to physicians doing the work that leadership cares, they're listening, they're letting us prioritize what we want to try to fix. They're empowering us to implement our ideas of what a better way might look like. And even if it didn't do what we had hoped, we can take another run at it. Or we can move on to the next thing that really irritates us and fix it. We often say this turns physicians from construction workers back into architects, co-creating their practice. The last piece I'll touch on is how do we address that isolation issue? And in this study, we took 75 physicians. We bought an hour of their time out of the clinic every 2 weeks. We randomized them to how that hour was spent. Half of them got it to do whatever they wished to use the hour for, typically to catch up on some of the clerical work they had to do and be able to get home a little earlier. The other group would meet with colleagues and engage in a facilitated conversation about some virtue or challenge about their professional life as a physician. And we measured these different wellness metrics. So this was the design of the trial. The two groups at the top both got an hour, randomized to how it was spent, and then we compared them to everybody else. And what we found is that both groups getting the hour had an improvement in burnout, largest in those meeting with colleagues. Only those meeting with colleagues had an improvement in meaning and work. And when we came back a year after the second time point, this was a 9-month intervention, a year after the intervention ended, the group who had been getting that hour to catch up on admin, their burnout score went immediately back to baseline as soon as they stopped getting the hour. It helps you as long as you're getting it. The group who had met with their colleagues during those 9 months had improved burnout and improved meaning and work a year after the intervention had ended. So we took that to the Mayo Clinic board, and we said, we've got something that would help. And they said, we like it, but it's too expensive. Try something else. And so our fundamental belief is that what was making a difference in that study had nothing to do with the structure of these groups and buying time out of the workday. We felt that was all the syringe, and that the medicine in the syringe was reconnecting colleagues to each other and having a chance to support each other through the personal and professional challenges of their work. So we had them sign up in the second study with 7 colleagues, agree to go to breakfast, lunch, dinner together once every 2 to 3 weeks. We would send them 5 questions, say pick the one your group wants to discuss, spend at least 15 minutes letting each person give their perspective on that topic, and then enjoy each other's company. We will buy the meal. And in a second randomized trial that Colin has presented and is under review now in full-length form, it had the exact same benefit as the first study, which was improved meaning in work and lower burnout for those meeting with colleagues. And when we took that to the board in November of 2016, they operationalized it within 24 hours. It said standard benefit, all 4,000 Mayo physicians and scientists, but nobody will go because one more night away from the family. We had half of the 2,400 physicians in Rochester join a group within 15 months. We've offered this to several groups at Stanford. We're now cascading it across multiple departments. And primary care, we had half the division join a group within 5 weeks. So people do go, and this is an important piece of bringing something back that we've lost along the way due to many changes in our practice environment. Does any of that stuff work? There have been 2 systematic reviews and meta-analysis. They both draw the same conclusion, which is that both individual and organization level interventions work, that they're complementary, that we need to do both. And we have data from organizations showing that once this is prioritized at the level of the organization, if you commit to it over a period of a couple years, you can really make a big difference about what the environment is as a place for your people to work. But it's a journey. All of our organizations are at different places. It begins with that first step, and I hope that for all of you, if nothing else, you engage with your local leaders. They tend to be listening to a greater degree now than they were historically, and engage them about what are some of these local things that we can act on over the next 3 to 6 months in our local environment to fix those local broken windows and begin that process of driving change in the work unit where you live. So with that, I think we have 1 or 2 minutes for questions, so thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Don't know if we, do we have mics? Yeah.
Dr. Shanafelt, thank you very much. So I think we do have 1 or 2 minutes for questions, and I see a hand raised right here. We do not have any microphones set up, so if you wouldn't mind approaching the stage, Dr. Shanafelt will restate your question. We'll have time for at least one.
My question was, have you looked at hospitalists by direct patient care hospitalists versus academic hospitalists? Has there been a difference in burnout?
Yeah, so the question is, have we looked at hospitalists in academic settings versus other practice settings, and is there a difference? And we haven't looked specifically at hospitalists. We have looked broadly across all physicians. Those in non-academic practice settings are at about 30% higher risk for burnout after we adjust for hours worked and all other variables. So those in academia do seem to be at a little bit lower risk. That said, there are differences by specialty in that regard. So when we've done studies with the College of Surgeons, academic surgeons, that fact is not true. In fact, the academic surgeons were at higher risk. And they tend to say that, the surgical expectations are the same independent of practice setting because it's such a revenue center. And so they just have to do all their academic work over and above. So there are some specialty variations there. In general, academic settings is a protective effect. But, we really need to look at the hospitalist update longitudinally, and that's a great question. Thank you.
In the last example, the idea that the administration
Yes, it's a great question. So the question was, increasingly, as we engage with administrative leaders, the greatest opportunities might not be the cheapest opportunities, I'll frame it that way, or the most inexpensive, but they might still pay big dividends. And how do we sort of, I'll cast it this way, build the business case to our administrative leaders that it's worth investing in this? And I think that there's increasingly a lot of data on that front. We had a paper about 2 years ago coming out called The Business Case for Addressing Physician Wellbeing. We have a manuscript that will come out soon in the Annals of Internal Medicine that we wrote with Harvard Business School, modeling the economic cost to organizations of this problem with sort of people who are expert in knowing how to do that. And I think with those type of data, you can increasingly put an actual cost per physician you employ on this problem. And that relates to turnover, data on productivity. It doesn't currently include, because it's hard to model, the cost of medical errors and malpractice litigation, but I think that data is developing. And depending on how you model it, if you can, rule of thumb, just multiply the number of physicians in your organization by about $10,000 to $15,000. That's what it's costing you a year, probably in a conservative estimate. So if you think about that, if you employ 1,000 physicians, it's costing you at least $10 million a year. And so you can then begin to think about what would the return on investment be if we allocated $1 million to this problem and reduced the risk by 5 or 10%. And you can do the math. And I think increasingly, as we have that strong evidence and we have increasing data on what magnitude of improvement can we expect from different interventions, you can start to have different conversations with administrative leaders. And you do often need to start with pilots, right? So that we might say, we're going to add members to the care team. We're going to add a scribe or a documentation assistant or somebody to take certain burdens off of the physicians, or we're going to invest in this new technology. And here's the cost. And if we can roll it out in these 3 units and see whether it has the intended effect, that often becomes a much more constructive conversations with the administrative leadership to get the opportunity to pilot something, demonstrate that it works, and then scale it. But I think increasingly there is a very strong economic case, and that allows us to engage our administrators not just with small things, but with real change. So I know we're out of time. Happy to stay up front, off to the side, and take more questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Hey, just a couple reminders as we're exiting. If you have not yet had a chance to check out HM19 at hand, the app, for access to the schedules, session presentations, and RIV abstracts, please do so. If you could, stop by the exhibit hall right now, for refreshments before the sessions begin, and enjoy the second day of our SHM Quick Talks that start at 10:15. And finally, don't forget to visit the exhibit hall today at noon for Clinical Vignettes poster. Thanks so much.